There was no army at the gates, no siege engines, no war drums echoing across the mountains. Just a man waking in the dark, reaching for his pillow and finding something cold beneath his hand. A dagger, placed there while he slept, while his guards stood at every door, while the walls of his fortress rose high enough to touch the clouds. The blade was not in his chest. That was the point, because the men who left it there wanted Sultan Sanjar to understand something far more unsettling than death. They wanted him to understand that they could have, that they had stood close enough to feel his breath, that they had chosen this time to let him live. Warning, traced back to a single man living high in the mountains of northern Persia. The message was quiet, almost gentle. It said, in effect, if I wished you harm, the dagger in the earth beside your pillow would instead be planted in your breast. Sultan Sanjar, a man who had commanded armies across Central Asia, who had faced the full military power of rival empires, reportedly turned pale and never spoke of the incident again. And that silence, that ancient, heavy silence, tells you more about these men than any battle ever could. They had no kingdom you could find on a map, no flag you could burn, no capital city you could lay siege to. What they had was something that made conventional power look fragile. They had the ability to reach anyone, anywhere, at any moment, and leave behind only the faint trace of a question. For over a century and a half, from the mountains of Persia to the sun-bleached plains of Syria, a single name was enough to empty a room, redirect a trade route, or force a king to reconsider every alliance he had ever made. They were called many things: the Nizari, the Ismaili, the Fedayeen, but the name that followed them across centuries, the one whispered in the courts of caliphs and Crusader kings alike, was the one their enemies gave them in contempt and which history never let go: the Assassins. And before we go any further into the buried layers of their story, before we walk through the fortress that should not have existed, the library that was lost to fire and conquest, and the unanswered questions that scholars are still circling today, I want to take just a moment. If you are here, watching at this hour, wherever in the world you are, thank you. This channel, Mr. H Chronicles, exists for exactly this kind of history, the kind that never quite made it into the textbooks, the kind that faded at the edges, slowly, over centuries, until only the outline remained. If that is what brought you here, then you are exactly where you belong. Hit subscribe if you have not already, and turn on the bell so the next time we go somewhere like this, you will know. Now, the dagger on the Sultan's pillow was not the beginning. It was not even close to the beginning. To understand how a small group of men, living in a remote mountain fortress with no standing army and no formal nation, managed to hold an entire region in a state of silent, undisturbed dread, for generations, we have to go back further. We have to go back to a man who was never supposed to become dangerous at all. To understand what Hassan-i Sabbah actually built, you have to start with the moment that most historians mention briefly and then move past, as if they are not entirely comfortable sitting with it too long: the dagger on the pillow. The account survives in the Jami al-Tawarik, the great Persian chronicle compiled by Rashid al-Din in the early 1300s, drawing from sources that were already centuries old by the time he wrote them down. The chronicle describes Sultan Sanjar, ruler of the Seljuk Empire, waking to find a dagger driven into the ground beside his sleeping body, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it without fully extending his arm. The guards outside had heard nothing. The interior watch reported nothing unusual, and yet someone had passed through every layer of protection surrounding the most powerful man in the region, stood over him while he slept. What followed was not a military response. What followed was a letter. Sanjar sent a messenger to Alamut, the mountain fortress where Hassan-i Sabbah had built his operation, demanding an explanation. The reply that came back has been preserved in fragmented form across multiple Persian sources. The meaning, stripped of the formal language of the period, was something close to this. The one who placed the dagger in the soft ground could just as easily have placed it somewhere else. We wished you to know this. Nothing more was needed. Sanjar, by most historical accounts, arranged a quiet agreement with the assassins shortly after. He stopped his military campaigns against their mountain strongholds. He was not defeated in battle. He simply understood the calculation. That is the part worth sitting with. Not the dagger itself, but the restraint behind it. any trained fighter can kill. The decision not to kill, performed with enough precision and enough witnesses, is something far more difficult to defend against. It lives inside the mind of the target, long after the physical threat has passed. It becomes a permanent presence in every room they enter, every meal they eat, every night they try to sleep. This was the architecture of what Hassan-i Sabbah constructed at Alamut. And it was not built from stone alone. The fortress itself sits at an elevation of roughly 2,163 meters in the Alborz mountain range, in what is now the Qazvin province of Iran. The approach from any direction is brutal. The ridge is narrow, the drop on either side severe enough that a small number of defenders could hold the position against forces many times their size. Hassan did not take it by force when he arrived in 1090. He took it by patience, by spending years placing trusted individuals inside the garrison, building relationships, waiting. When the moment came, the transfer of control was almost quiet. The previous commander reportedly received a formal payment and left without violence. What happened inside those walls over the following decades has been studied by researchers from the University of Tehran, who conducted a series of ground surveys and limited excavations between 2004 and 2009. What they found, and what remains only partially understood, are the remnants of a sophisticated internal infrastructure. Water channels cut into the rock, storage facilities that could have sustained a population for years without resupply, and beneath certain sections of the fortress, the suggestion of tunneled passages extending into the surrounding terrain, the full extent of which has never been completely mapped. Archaeologists have noted that the destruction visited upon Alamut by the Mongols in 1256 was thorough enough to make confident reconstruction difficult. Much of what we know about the daily operations of the fortress comes not from physical evidence but from sources written by people who never entered it, people who had strong reasons to describe it in the darkest possible terms. That matters, because the historical record around the assassins is not a neutral document. It was largely written by their enemies, by Sunni chroniclers who viewed the Nizari Ismaili sect as heretics, by Crusader historians who encountered them in Syria and brought those accounts back to Europe, filtered through their own fear and suspicion, and eventually by scholars working from those same compromised sources. What remains unexplained is how much of what we think we know about the internal life of Alamut is description, and how much is deliberate distortion. One theory suggests that the library housed within Alamut, described by contemporaries as one of the most significant collections in the medieval Islamic world, contained not only theological and philosophical texts, but detailed records of the organization's actual structure, its communication systems, its agreements with outside powers, and the identities of its embedded agents. If that is true, then the Mongol burning of that library was not simply a cultural loss. It was the permanent erasure of the most complete account of how the assassins actually functioned. We are left, then, with fragments. A dagger pressed into a floorboard beside a sleeping sultan. A letter that arrived from a mountain fortress and ended a military campaign without a single battle. A network of passages beneath ancient stone that no one has fully followed to their end. The incident that most historians move past quickly turns out, on closer examination, to be less of an anecdote and more of a key. It tells you almost everything you need to understand about how this organization operated, what it valued, and why it lasted as long as it did. They were not interested in the kill itself. They were interested in what the possibility of the kill could do to the mind of a man who believed himself untouchable. And that idea, first demonstrated on a cold morning in 1105 beside a sleeping sultan, would go on to reshape the political landscape of the medieval world for the next century and a half. It began, as so many ancient things do, with a single man who understood something that no one around him had yet realized. That the most powerful weapon in the world has never been the one you use. It is the one you simply let your enemy know you have. There is a story, repeated in several Persian sources and carried forward by historians for centuries, that three young men once made a promise to each other in a schoolroom in Nishapur. They were students together at the Nizamiya, one of the most prestigious centers of learning in the medieval Islamic world. Three sharp minds, three very different temperaments, and one shared understanding that whoever among them rose to greatness first would carry the other two along with him. The three names were Omar Khayyam, Nizam al-Mulk, and Hassan-i Sabbah. One would become the most celebrated poet and mathematician of the Persian Golden Age. His verse is still quoted 1,000 years later. One would become the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire, the most powerful administrative mind in the Islamic world. And one would become something that neither history nor language has ever found a clean category for. The story of that schoolroom pact may be partly legend. Historians like Farhad Daftari, in his landmark work The Ismailis, their history and doctrines, have noted that the timelines are difficult to reconcile perfectly and that the tale grew more polished with each retelling. But what is not legend is what these three men actually became. And the distance between their paths is one of the most quietly remarkable things in the entire medieval record. Hassan-i Sabbah was born around 1050, most likely in the city of Qom in central Persia, into a family of 12 Shia background. From an early age, the accounts describe someone who absorbed knowledge the way others absorbed air. Astronomy, philosophy. He moved through disciplines the way a scholar twice his age might have, and he moved through them fast. By his early 20s, he had already begun drifting toward the Ismaili branch of Shia Islam, a movement that the dominant Sunni establishment of the time regarded with a mixture of suspicion and open hostility. The Ismailis believed in a living imam, a continuing line of sacred leadership descending from the Prophet through his cousin Ali, and they organized their understanding of faith in layers with deeper esoteric meaning reserved for those who had earned the right to receive it. For a mind like Hassan's, this layered architecture of knowledge was not just theologically compelling, it was structurally fascinating. Nizam al-Mulk, his former classmate, had by this point risen to extraordinary power within the Seljuk court, and for a brief moment it appeared that he might honor the old promise. Hassan entered the court. He was given access. He was noticed, and then something happened. The precise details are buried beneath competing accounts, but what most sources agree on is that Hassan was either forced out or chose to leave under circumstances that left a permanent mark. Some chronicles suggest Nizam al-Mulk engineered his removal out of political jealousy. Others suggest Hassan's open Ismaili sympathies made his presence at a Sunni Seljuk court an impossibility that was always going to resolve itself one way. What remains unexplained is whether Hassan left with bitterness or with a plan already forming. Perhaps both. What followed was a journey that reads, even today, like something from the margins of the world. Hassan travelled west into Egypt, to Cairo, where the Fatimid Caliphate, an Ismaili dynasty, held power. He spent approximately 3 years there, from around 1078 to 1081, studying, observing, and apparently undergoing some kind of deepening of his mission that he carried back with him in silence. What he learned in Cairo, what he was shown, what he was given, is not fully known. One theory suggests he received direct initiation into the upper ranks of the Ismaili Dawah, the missionary and organizational structure that the Fatimids had been building for over a century. Archaeologists and historians have noted that the Fatimid Dawah was arguably the most sophisticated underground network in the medieval world at that point, operating simultaneously as a religious movement, an intelligence apparatus, and a political insurgency. Hassan absorbed all of it. He returned to Persia and spent the next several years moving through the country quietly, building a network of contacts, identifying sympathetic communities, mapping the landscape, not just geographically, but politically. Not a city, not a population centre, not wealth. He found it in the Alborz mountains of northern Persia. The fortress of Alamut sat on a narrow ridge at an elevation of roughly 2,163 meters in what is now the Qazvin province of Iran. It was technically already held by a local ruler, but Hassan had spent enough time studying the surrounding valleys to know that the population there leaned toward Ismaili sympathies. He did not attack Alamut. He simply began working his way inside it, sending missionaries, building relationships, converting the garrison to his cause one man at a time. In 1190, he walked through the gates of Alamut and informed the ruler, as accounts tell it with remarkable calm, that he now lived in Hassan's house. The ruler was given a note of payment and escorted away without a drop of blood. That bloodless takeover is worth pausing on, because it tells you more about Hassan-i Sabbah than almost any other single moment in his life. This was not a man driven by violence. Violence, to him, was a tool, and like any precise instrument, its value lay in using it only when nothing else would achieve the result. The seizure of Alamut was won through patience, through intelligence, through years of invisible preparation. The dagger would come later, but it would always be the last argument, not the first. Inside Alamut, Hassan established something that had no real precedent in the medieval world. A fortified center of learning, training, and operations that functioned simultaneously as a monastery, a military academy, and the nerve center of a growing network of agents dispersed across the Islamic world. He reportedly never left the fortress for the remaining 35 years of his life. 35 years. Inside those walls, while the world outside shifted around him, empires rose and fractured, crusades began, dynasties collapsed, and Hassan sat at the center of his mountain and watched it all, and waited, and planned. What remains unexplained, and what scholars like Marshall Hodgson spent years turning over in the Order of Assassins, is the nature of Hassan's inner life during those decades. No personal journals survive, no letters of any intimacy, only the structure he built, the operations he authorized, and 2 sentences attributed to him near the end of his life that have echoed quietly through the centuries ever since. Nothing is true. Whether he actually said those words, historians are not certain. But the organization he built behaved as though someone had. What remains unexplained, and what scholars like Marshall Hodgson spent years turning over in the Order of Assassins, is the nature of Hassan's inner life during those decades. No personal journals survive, no letters of any intimacy, only the structure he built, the operations he authorized, and 2 sentences attributed to him near the end of his life that have echoed quietly through the centuries ever since. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. Whether he actually said those words, historians are not certain. But the organization he built behaved as though someone had. And somewhere out there tonight, you are listening to this from a corner of the world that Hassan-i Sabbah never knew existed. Maybe it is late where you are, the room dark, and the rest of the house already asleep. Maybe you are somewhere the sun has just gone down, or somewhere it has not yet risen. Wherever you are, whatever hour the clock is showing you right now, drop it in the comments below. There is something quietly remarkable about a story this ancient, reaching so many different places at once, and Mr. H genuinely wants to know where in the world you are carrying it tonight. There is a ridge in the Alborz Mountains of northern Iran, roughly 100 kilometers northwest of Tehran, where the rock rises so steeply from the valley floor that the locals have a saying about it. They say the eagles do not nest there, because even eagles prefer ground they can leave quickly. Alamut sits on that ridge. At 2,163 meters above sea level, the fortress occupies a narrow spine of rock approximately 500 meters long and no wider than 35 meters at its broadest point. Below it, on every side, the cliffs drop away into the Alamut River Valley, a tangle of gorges and seasonal paths that even experienced mountain guides today will tell you require careful navigation. In the 11th century, before roads, before maps of any reliable kind, reaching Alamut from the valley floor meant committing to a climb that left you completely exposed for the better part of an hour, which was precisely the point. The name Alamut comes from the local Daylami dialect, and most scholars translate it as either eagle's nest or eagle's teaching, depending on the source. The fortress had existed in some form since the 9th century. Originally built by a local ruler named Wasudan ibn Marzuban, though what stood there before Hassan-i Sabbah arrived was modest compared to what it would become. What Hassan inherited was a defensible position. What he built was something closer to a self-contained civilization. The physical reconstruction of Alamut under Hassan's direction is one of the more underappreciated feats of medieval engineering. Archaeological surveys conducted by Iranian teams throughout the 1960s, and more extensively between 2004 and 2009, documented evidence of an elaborate water management system, channels carved directly into the rock that directed rainfall, and snowmelt into underground cisterns capable of sustaining the fortress population through years of siege without outside supply. The engineering required to design and execute that system at that altitude, with the tools of the 11th century, was not accidental. It was the work of people who understood that if you were going to hold a position indefinitely against enemies with vastly superior numbers, you had to solve the problem of time. Food storage presented the same challenge and the same precision. Accounts from Persian chronicles describe granaries carved into the interior rock, sealed and climate-regulated by the natural cooling of the mountain, capable of preserving provisions for periods that contemporary sources put at anywhere from 2 to 5 years. One theory suggests the actual capacity exceeded even these estimates, and that Alamut was designed from the beginning to outlast any conventional siege that a Seljuk army could sustain before its own supply lines collapsed. If accurate, that means Hassan was not simply building a fortress. He was building a strategic trap that looked like a target, but the physical structure was only one layer of what Alamut represented. Inside those walls, Hassan established a library that several medieval sources describe in terms that seem almost implausible given the location. The Persian historian Juwayni, writing in the 13th century after the Mongol destruction, noted with what reads as genuine grief that the library at Alamut contained collections in astronomy, philosophy, mathematics, and religious scholarship that had no equivalent in the surrounding region. Juwayni was not sympathetic to the assassins, which makes his acknowledgement of the library's scope more significant, not less. He was recording a loss he found meaningful even as he was documenting the destruction of a movement he opposed. Archaeologists have noted that the physical evidence recovered from the Alamut site is frustratingly incomplete, precisely because of how thoroughly the Mongols dismantled the structure in 1256. What survives is foundation work, cistern channels, fragments of ceramic and metalwork, and the carved rock interiors of several chambers whose original purpose remains a matter of ongoing interpretation. A survey conducted by the Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization in the early 2000s identified at least 3 subterranean spaces beneath the main ridge structure that had not been fully excavated. Their contents, if any, remain still undisturbed. What remains unexplained is the full extent of the tunnel network that multiple independent sources reference. Marco Polo, traveling through Persia roughly 4 decades after the Mongol destruction, described hearing accounts of underground passages connecting Alamut to surrounding valleys that would have represented an extraordinary engineering undertaking. Historians have long treated the Marco Polo account with appropriate caution, given how much of his Persian material was gathered second-hand, filtered through interpreters, and shaped by the storytelling expectations of his European audience. But the tunnel references appear in sources that predate Marco Polo and carry no obvious motivation for invention, which leaves the question genuinely open. What the fortress represented symbolically may ultimately matter more than any of its physical dimensions. In an era when power was measured by the size of your army, the fertility of your lands, and the depth of your treasury, Alamut stood as a deliberate argument against all three. Hassan had no significant army by the standards of the time. The land around Alamut was rugged and not particularly productive, and the assassins never accumulated wealth in any form that their enemies could locate or threaten. What they had instead was position, elevation, patience, and a library full of knowledge that nobody outside the mountain fully understood. There is something worth sitting with quietly in that image. A fortress on a cliff that most armies could not reach, run by a man who never left, filled with books that no one outside was permitted to read, training men whose loyalty outlasted torture and whose silence outlasted death. The Seljuk Empire looked up at that ridge and saw a problem it could not solve with the tools it had. The Crusader kingdoms, when they eventually encountered the network Alamut had built, found themselves doing the same, and the Mongols, who solved most problems by simply destroying everything in a given radius, found that even their particular solution carried unexpected complications. The mountain endured, the questions it held endured longer, and somewhere beneath that narrow spine of ancient rock, in chambers that have not been opened in centuries, it is entirely possible that some of those questions are still waiting. There is a story that travelled across the medieval world faster than any army, whispered in the courts of Crusader kings, carried along trade routes from Damascus to Venice, and eventually committed to paper by a Venetian merchant who may or may not have actually seen what he claimed to have seen. The story goes like this. Deep within the walls of Alamut, Hassan-i Sabbah had constructed a garden. Not an ordinary garden, but something designed to replicate, as closely as human hands could manage, the paradise described in the Quran. Flowing streams, fruit-laden trees, flowers of every color the mountain climate could sustain, and within this garden, young men would be brought while they slept, carried through hidden passages after being given a drink that stole their consciousness as gently as nightfall. They would wake inside the garden. They would be given food, music, wine, and every comfort that the medieval imagination associated with the divine reward, awaiting the faithful after death. And then, after hours, or perhaps days of this, they would be made to sleep again, carried back to their ordinary rooms, and brought before Hassan himself. He would ask them what they had seen, and when they described it, he would tell them simply that what they had experienced was a glimpse, a single brief window into the paradise that awaited any man willing to give his life completely to the cause. This is the story Marco Polo told. He recorded it in his travels around 1298, describing it as something he had heard while passing through Persia. The tale spread. It was repeated, embellished, carried forward through centuries of European writing about the Islamic world, and it became one of the most persistent images attached to the assassins in the Western imagination. There is only one significant problem with it. Almost no serious scholar of Ismaili history believes it happened the way Marco Polo described. Farhad Daftari, whose research at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London represents some of the most rigorous academic work done on this period, has argued extensively that the Paradise Garden story belongs to a category of medieval propaganda, tales constructed by enemies of the Ismaili movement to discredit both their theology and their methods. The Crusaders had reason to paint them as manipulators of drugged fanatics. The Sunni establishment had even stronger reason, and Marco Polo, for all the genuine value of his travels, was recording second-hand accounts of a fortress that had already been destroyed for over 40 years by the time he passed through the region. One theory suggests the entire hashish narrative, the very root of the word assassin, which most etymologists trace to the Arabic term hashishin, meaning users of hashish, was a slur invented and spread by the Fatimid establishment in Cairo after a political split with the Nizari Ismailis in the 11th century. Daftari and other scholars have noted that not a single contemporary Ismaili source, not one document produced from within Alamut itself, ever mentions hashish in connection with the training or motivation of the Fadayan. The word appears almost exclusively in texts written by people who opposed them. What remains unexplained is how a name rooted in what was almost certainly a political insult became the word that 900 years later entered every major language on earth as the standard term for a hired killer. But here is what makes this history genuinely strange. Strip away the garden, strip away the hashish, strip away Marco Polo entirely. What you are left with is something that, in certain ways, is more difficult to explain than the legend. The Fedayeen, the inner circle of trained operatives that Hassan built over decades at Alamut, were real. Their operations were real. The men who carried out assassinations in crowded mosques, in palace courtyards, in the middle of pilgrimage routes surrounded by thousands of witnesses, were real. And what made them unlike almost any other force in the medieval world was not that they were drugged or deceived. It was that they did not run. In the killing of Nizam al-Mulk in 1092, the Fedayeen who carried out the strike made no attempt to escape. In the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192, the two operatives who carried out the attack stood and waited for the response. Across dozens of recorded operations, the pattern holds. These were men who had reached a psychological state in which their own survival after the mission was simply not a primary variable. Understanding how that state was produced is where the real story lives. Archaeologists have noted that the physical layout of Alamut, based on excavations carried out in the 1960s by the scholar W. Ivanhoe and later surveys conducted by Iranian research teams in the early 2000s, suggests a compound designed not just for defense, but for an unusually self-contained way of life. There were gardens, though their nature was agricultural rather than paradisiacal. There were spaces that appear to have served as classrooms or study rooms. There was a library of considerable scale, And there was, significantly, what appears to have been a dedicated space for philosophical instruction separate from any mosque or prayer area. The training system Hassan designed drew from Ismaili theology but extended far beyond it. Recruits were educated in philosophy, in logic, in the Neoplatonic intellectual tradition that had filtered into Islamic scholarship through translations of Greek texts. They were taught to think in layers, to understand that surface appearances concealed deeper truths, that the world as most people experienced it was incomplete. This was not recruitment through fear or through chemical manipulation. It was recruitment through a carefully constructed intellectual and spiritual framework that made the mission feel not just meaningful, but cosmically necessary. One theory suggests that the Fedayeen were selected precisely because they were already individuals of unusual intellectual and psychological depth, and that the years of training at Alamut functioned less as indoctrination and more as a kind of concentrated education designed to bring a certain type of person to a specific conclusion about the nature of sacrifice and truth. What remains unexplained is how that conclusion, once reached, proved so stable. Not one Fedayeen, across the entire recorded history of the order, is known to have broken under interrogation and revealed the operational structure of the network. Not one defected, not one recanted publicly in a way that damaged the organization. For an operation that lasted over a century and a half, across multiple generations of leadership and shifting political circumstances, that silence is perhaps the most ancient mystery the assassins left behind. The Paradise Garden may be a story someone else told about them to make their enemies afraid, or to make their methods seem less rational than they were, or simply because the truth was harder to explain than a garden full of wine and wonder. The truth, to the extent that it can be recovered at all, is quieter and in many ways more unsettling. These were not men who had been tricked into dying. They were men who had been, through years of careful and deliberate formation, genuinely convinced that what they were doing was the most important thing a human life could be spent on. And in the long, silent history of organizations that have asked people to die for a cause that may be the most sobering detail of all, there is a story that traveled west from Persia, through the mouths of merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims, and eventually found its way into the written account of a Venetian trader who claimed he had heard it from those who knew the mountains of the east. Marco Polo recorded it sometime around 1298, in a book that his contemporaries largely dismissed as fantasy. He described a hidden valley somewhere in the Alborz Mountains, walled off from the outside world, filled with gardens of impossible beauty, flowing streams, fruit-heavy trees, pavilions of silk and gold, and young women whose presence alone would convince any man that he had wandered into something beyond the ordinary world. According to Polo, the leader of this place would select young men from the surrounding villages, drug them into unconsciousness, carry them into the valley while they slept, and allow them to wake inside what appeared to be paradise itself. They would spend days there, eating, drinking, experiencing everything the medieval imagination associated with divine reward. And then they would be drugged again, carried back out, and would wake in a bare room with Hassan-i Sabbah standing over them, explaining that what they had seen was the reward that awaited those who served faithfully and without question, even unto death. It is an extraordinary story, and for centuries it was repeated as fact, woven into the foundational mythology of the assassins, used to explain how ordinary men could be turned into weapons willing to die without hesitation. The problem is that nearly every serious historian who has examined it closely has found the evidence extraordinarily thin. Farhad Daftari, whose decades of research into Ismaili history produced some of the most rigorously sourced scholarship on this period, has argued that the Paradise Garden story belongs more to the literature of anti-Ismaili propaganda than to any verifiable record. The Nizari Ismailis had powerful enemies who had every reason to portray them as manipulators of drugged and deluded fanatics, rather than as a theologically sophisticated movement with genuine intellectual foundations. One theory suggests the entire narrative was constructed and circulated deliberately, the medieval equivalent of a disinformation campaign, designed to delegitimize the assassins by reducing their Fedayeen to mindless, chemically controlled automatons, rather than men who had made a reasoned commitment to a cause. The word hashishin itself, from which the Western term assassin slowly descended across several languages over several centuries, most likely began as a slur. It appears in texts written by Sunni opponents of the Ismailis as a term of contempt, not a description of actual practice. Archaeologists have noted that no physical evidence of large-scale hashish cultivation or storage has ever been recovered from the sites of Alamut or Masyaf, the two primary assassin fortresses that have undergone any serious excavation. And yet something real was happening inside those walls. Something that produced men willing to walk into the presence of the most heavily guarded rulers in the medieval world, carry out a killing in broad daylight surrounded by witnesses, and accept their own deaths immediately afterward without any apparent attempt to escape. That is not the behavior of people who were simply following orders. That is the behavior of people who believed, completely and without reservation, in something larger than their own survival. What the assassins actually built inside Alamut was a system of indoctrination far more sophisticated than a drugged garden and a staged illusion. The Ismaili Dawah, the missionary and teaching structure that Hassan had studied in Cairo and then refined into something entirely his own, operated in graduated layers. New initiates received only the outermost circle of knowledge. As trust was established and commitment demonstrated, deeper layers were opened. Each level carried more esoteric theological content, more philosophical complexity, and a correspondingly deeper sense of belonging to something ancient and chosen and true. This structure was not invented by Hassan. It drew on Neoplatonic traditions of graduated knowledge, on Shia concepts of hidden meaning beneath the surface of sacred texts, and on the Fatimid organizational model that had been developing in Cairo for over a century before Hassan ever arrived there. What Hassan did was take that structure and engineer it with a precision that has impressed even modern analysts of organizational behavior. The Fedayeen, those who were selected for the most dangerous operations, were not the bottom of this hierarchy. They were among the most deeply initiated. They had moved through years of philosophical and theological education. They had been given reasons, not just commands. They understood, within the framework they had been taught, exactly why what they were doing mattered, and exactly what they believed awaited them. What remains unexplained is how that belief was maintained across generations and across a network scattered through multiple countries, without any of the normal institutional structures that religious movements rely on. No central mosque, no public preaching, no visible hierarchy that an outsider could map or an enemy could simply cut the head from. The training itself combined elements that would look familiar to anyone who has studied the psychology of deep organizational commitment. Physical discipline, prolonged periods of isolation, followed by intense community, the gradual revelation of knowledge presented as sacred and exclusive, and woven through all of it, a theological framework that recast death not as an ending, but as a passage into something the rest of the world was not yet permitted to understand. Whether or not Marco Polo's garden ever existed in any literal sense, the psychological architecture it was meant to represent was absolutely real. Hassan-i Sabbah had built something inside those mountain walls that no sultan, no caliph, no Crusader king had managed to construct with all their resources and all their armies. He had built men who were no longer afraid. And in a world where fear was the primary currency of power, that made the assassins something that the medieval mind had no existing framework to process. Which is perhaps why the story of the garden, the drugs, the artificial paradise spread so easily and held on so long. It was simpler than the truth. And the truth, as it so often does, was buried quietly beneath the legend, waiting in the ancient silence of the mountains for someone to come looking. There is a question that serious historians have been circling for decades, and it has never been fully resolved. How did they do it? Not the killings themselves. The killings, in a certain cold light, are almost the simpler part of the story. A man trained for years in patience and disguise, placed near a target, waiting for the right moment. That much, at least, follows a logic the mind can trace. What does not follow any logic that contemporary rulers could understand? What kept viziers and sultans and Crusader kings awake in their chambers long after the candles had burned down was something far more unsettling than the act of assassination itself. It was the coordination. A target falls in Damascus. Within days, a corresponding message has been received in a valley in northern Persia. A decision is made in Alamut, and somehow, without a single written order that anyone can intercept, without a courier anyone can follow, Without a carrier pigeon anyone can shoot from the sky, that decision arrives in the hands of the right person, in the right city, at the right moment. For an empire built on controlling roads, taxing trade routes, and monitoring the movement of people across vast distances, this was not just a security problem. It was a philosophical one. You cannot defend against a network you cannot see. You cannot destroy a chain of command you cannot map. And for over a century and a half, no one could map it. What historians like Heinz Halm, in his foundational work Shi'ism, published in 1991, have pieced together from surviving Ismaili documents and hostile contemporary sources is a picture of something genuinely without precedent in the medieval world. The assassins did not operate through a single chain of command running downward from Alamut like a ladder. They operated through something closer to a web, or perhaps more accurately, something closer to what a modern intelligence analyst might recognize as a cellular network. The structure was divided into ranks. Most scholars, working from available sources, identify somewhere between 7 and 9 distinct levels within the organization, each with access to a different layer of information. A new initiate knew almost nothing beyond his immediate task and his immediate contact. A mid-level operative might know the identity of 2 or 3 others in his region, the location of a safe house, and a set of signals for communication, but nothing about operations happening elsewhere. Only those in the innermost circles, those closest to Hassan himself, and later to his successors, held anything resembling a complete picture. This architecture was not accidental. It was, in the language of modern security, a need-to-know compartmentalization system, and it was functioning in the mountains of Persia nearly 9 centuries before that phrase was coined in the Cold War intelligence community. If a Fedayeen was captured, and some were, torture produced almost nothing of operational value, not because the captured man was particularly resistant, but because he genuinely did not know enough to give anything away. He knew his contact. He knew his signal. He knew his target. Everything beyond that was darkness. The communication methods themselves are among the most quietly fascinating details in this entire history. Archaeologists have noted that excavations at Alamut and surrounding Nizari fortress sites have produced almost no written administrative documents, which is extraordinary for an organization that maintained operations across a geographic range, stretching from Persia through Syria and into the borderlands of the Crusader states. Either those documents were destroyed systematically before the Mongol siege of 1256, or they were never committed to writing in any recoverable form to begin with. What the sources do describe, filtered through hostile chroniclers who were themselves working from fragments and rumors, is a system of signals embedded in the texture of ordinary life. A particular object placed in a specific location, a phrase inserted into an otherwise unremarkable conversation, a piece of cloth tied to a tree at a crossroads in a colour and pattern that meant nothing to anyone passing by, except the one person who had been told what to look for, a coin with a particular mark left at a market stall, a greeting exchanged between 2 strangers at a caravanserai that contained, folded inside its ordinary words, an entire set of instructions. One theory suggests that the assassins made extensive use of the existing infrastructure of Ismaili missionary networks, the Dawah system that had been operating across the Islamic world since the Fatimid period, essentially piggybacking operational communications onto religious and commercial channels that no one thought to monitor because they appeared entirely unremarkable. A travelling merchant who was also a Dai, a missionary, moving between cities for reasons of trade that were entirely legitimate, carrying information that existed nowhere in writing and could not be extracted even if he were stopped and searched. What remains unexplained is how this system maintained its integrity across such distances and across generations of leadership. Networks of this kind, built on trust and silence rather than written protocol, tend to fracture. People defect. People talk. People, under sufficient pressure, break. And yet, across the entire documented history of the Nizari assassins, the number of confirmed betrayals from within the organization is, by any reasonable measure, close to 0. No Fedayeen is recorded as having given up the network under interrogation. No mid-level operative turned informant for a Seljuk or Abbasid reward. The silence held for over 150 years. That fact alone, stripped of everything else, is one of the most remarkable things in the medieval historical record. And it points to something that the purely operational analysis of the network tends to underestimate. The communication system worked not just because it was cleverly designed, but because the people inside it believed, with a completeness that made external pressure largely irrelevant in what they were part of. You can intercept a letter. You can follow a courier. You can bribe an administrator or break a cipher given enough time and resources, but you cannot intercept a belief that has never been written down. That was the final layer of the network, not the signals or the symbols or the cellular structure, but the interior architecture of the people who carried it. Hassan-i Sabbah had not simply built an organization, he had built a condition of mind that functioned as its own encryption. And for the rulers of the medieval world, staring at their maps and their treasury reports and their military rosters, trying to find the edge of something they could not even fully confirm existed, that was the deepest silence of all, the kind that follows you long after the candle goes out. By the time the Crusades reached their bloodiest decades, the assassins had already been operating for nearly a century. They had buried viziers, toppled political architectures, and turned paranoia into a form of governance across the Islamic world. But what happened when their network brushed against the armies of Christian Europe is a chapter that the official histories of both sides have handled with considerable care and considerable silence. The year is 1192. The Third Crusade is grinding toward an exhausted stalemate. Richard, the First of England, and Saladin have been trading blows across the Holy Land for months, and the question of who will control Jerusalem has hardened into something neither side can fully resolve by force alone. Into this landscape of fractured alliances and desperate maneuvering, a single event lands like a stone dropped into still water. Conrad of Montferrat, Marquis of Tyre, has just been elected King of Jerusalem. He is arguably the most capable military and political mind the Crusader states have produced. He has held Tyre against Saladin when every other city fell. He has negotiated, survived, outmaneuvered. The Crusader cause, such as it is at this point, needs him. On the 28th of April, 1192, Conrad is walking through the streets of Tyre after a dinner engagement. They are dressed as Christian monks, a detail recorded in the Crusader Chronicle Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi, compiled within years of the event. They have been present in the city for weeks, moving quietly, attending services, drawing no attention. When they reach Conrad, they produce daggers. He is struck twice and dies within the hour. Both men are captured immediately. One dies during the struggle, the other is taken alive, and under questioning identifies himself as a Fadayan of Sinan, the assassin commander in Syria. He does not appear to resist the identification. He offers it, according to contemporary accounts, with something approaching calm. What follows that confession is where the history becomes genuinely complicated. Within days of Conrad's death, suspicion falls in multiple directions simultaneously. Saladin is named by some Crusader voices. Though the logic is thin, Conrad had recently been in negotiations with Saladin that might have served both their interests. The assassins themselves, under Sinan, had grievances against Conrad related to a seized assassin ship and cargo that Conrad had refused to return. That motive is documented. It is real. But there is a third name that surfaces in the chronicles, and it is the one that has never been fully put to rest: Richard I of England. One theory suggests, and it was a theory circulating within months of the assassination, not centuries later, that Richard had either commissioned the killing directly or had communicated to Sinan that Conrad's removal would not be unwelcome. The source most often cited is the account of the medieval historian Ibn Nasr, as well as references within the chronicle of Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin's personal biographer. Richard had his own candidate for the Jerusalem throne, his nephew, Henry of Champagne, who was installed as the new ruler within days of Conrad's death, a speed that struck contemporaries as either fortunate or suspicious depending on their loyalties. What remains unexplained is the precision of that timing. Henry of Champagne was positioned to assume leadership almost immediately. The transition was smooth in a way that chaotic medieval politics rarely permitted without prior arrangement. Richard denied involvement. He would continue to deny it, and no document has ever emerged that conclusively proves the connection. But the assassins were not finished writing themselves into the margins of Crusader history. Sinan, the Syrian commander of the order, known across the Crusader states as the Old Man of the Mountain, had by this point developed something that no purely military force could have achieved. He had made himself useful to multiple sides simultaneously. The Crusader lords of the coastal cities understood that Sinan's network extended through territory they could not control, and among populations they could not read. Rather than treating the assassins as enemies, several Crusader states had arrived at an arrangement that historians like Bernard Lewis documented in detail in The Assassins. A radical sect in Islam, the assassins received a form of tribute from the Knights Hospitaller and possibly from other Crusader entities, framed not as payment but as a kind of diplomatic acknowledgement. In practical terms, powerful Christian institutions were sending money and gifts to an Ismaili Muslim organization responsible for political murders across the region. That sentence does not appear in many textbooks. One theory suggests this arrangement was considerably more operational than the surviving documents indicate, that the assassins functioned at various points as contractors for Crusader political objectives, removing figures whose death served European interests in the region. Archaeologists and scholars examining the correspondence records of the period, including those analysed by Jonathan Riley Smith in his work on Crusader politics, have noted an unusual pattern. Several individuals whose deaths benefited Crusader territorial ambitions died at assassin hands during periods when diplomatic contact between Crusader leadership and Sinan was documented. Correlation is not causation. The historical record is incomplete by centuries of loss and deliberate destruction, but the pattern is there, quietly, in the surviving documents, and it does not resolve itself into a clean explanation. There is one more thread worth following before we leave this period. Saladin himself, the great unifier of Muslim resistance against the Crusades, had his own encounter with the assassins that rarely receives the attention it deserves. In 1176, Saladin marched his forces into the Nusairiyah mountains of Syria and laid siege to the region surrounding Sinan's fortress at Masyaf. By any military calculation, it should have been a straightforward campaign. Saladin had vastly superior numbers. The terrain was difficult, but not impossible. He withdrew without taking the fortress. The accounts of why he withdrew differ. Some describe an intermediary negotiation. Some describe a dream Saladin claimed to have experienced, in which Sinan appeared to him and left burning coals beside his head, a warning that carried the same psychological architecture as the dagger on Sultan Sanjar's pillow 70 years earlier. What is recorded without dispute is that after the withdrawal, Saladin reportedly slept each night inside a specially constructed wooden tower, with guards maintaining contact with him at all times, and for a significant period refused to allow anyone near him whose background he could not personally verify. The most feared military commander of the medieval Islamic world was sleeping inside a locked box because of one man in a mountain fortress who had chosen, so far, not to kill him. What remains unexplained is what was communicated between Sinan and Saladin during that withdrawal. No treaty was formally recorded. No terms were published. Whatever passed between them in those days in the mountains of Syria in 1176 remained between them, and the silence around it has lasted for over 800 years. The Crusades are remembered as a collision of civilizations, Christian and Muslim, Europe and the Near East, competing visions of sacred geography. But running beneath that collision, threading through its politics and its betrayals and its uneasy truces, was a third force that answered to neither side completely, that sold its capabilities to whoever could meet its terms, and that left its fingerprints on some of the most consequential deaths of the entire era. They were never fully Christian. They were never fully aligned with any Muslim power. They were something older and more patient than either, and by the time the Crusades finally exhausted themselves, the assassins were still there, still watching, still waiting, still deciding who deserved to live another season. There is a moment recorded in the chronicles of the Crusades that historians have never been able to fully explain. Saladin, at the height of his power, had surrounded the fortress of Masyaf in what is now the Hama province of western Syria. This was the man who had reunified the fractured Islamic world, who had taken Jerusalem back from the Crusaders in 1187, who commanded an army that had broken every force sent against it. He had every military reason to press forward. Masyaf was not impregnable. His numbers were overwhelming. The siege, by every reasonable calculation, should have continued until the walls came down, and then, without a clear explanation in any of the official records, Saladin lifted the siege and withdrew. What happened in the days between the encirclement of Masyaf and that withdrawal has been passed down through several accounts. None of them entirely consistent, all of them pointing toward the same man, Rashid al-Din Sinan. He is the figure history remembers as the Old Man of the Mountain, though the title was applied loosely to several assassin leaders over the years. In Sinan's case, it carried a weight that the others never quite accumulated. He led the Syrian branch of the Nizari Ismaili network from roughly 1162 until his death in 1193, operating out of Masyaf and a cluster of surrounding fortresses in the mountains above the Syrian coastal plain. And in those 3 decades, he built something that even the broader assassin organization, headquartered far away in Alamut. Sinan was not simply an extension of the Persian leadership. He was, by most historical accounts, something closer to an autonomous force. When the Grand Masters at Alamut sent orders he disagreed with, he ignored them. When they sent envoys to bring him back into line, those envoys reportedly returned to Persia, having accomplished very little. Sinan understood the landscape around him, the competing pressures of the Crusader states to the west, the Sunni powers to the east, the Byzantine remnants to the north, with a clarity that allowed him to move between them in ways that no purely military force could have managed. The story told about Saladin's withdrawal involves a sequence of events that begins with a messenger arriving in Saladin's camp in the night. The accounts vary in their details, but the essential thread is consistent across multiple medieval sources, including the biography written by Saladin's secretary Imad al-Din al-Isfahani. Sinan had sent word, and the word carried with it a demonstration of reach that made argument unnecessary. One theory suggests the message arrived accompanied by proof that assassin agents were already positioned within Saladin's innermost circle, close enough to act. Whether that proof was a poisoned cake left beside his sleeping form, a letter that named his most trusted companions, or something else entirely, the sources do not agree. What remains unexplained is how Sinan could have known enough about the internal arrangement of Saladin's camp to make such a demonstration credible. But credible it apparently was. Saladin withdrew, and he never moved against Masyaf again. What makes Sinan genuinely remarkable, beyond the episode with Saladin, is the nature of the loyalty he generated among the communities living in and around his mountain fortresses. This was not the loyalty of fear alone, though fear was certainly present. Contemporary accounts from both Muslim and Crusader sources describe populations that believed Sinan possessed knowledge that ordinary men could not access, that he could see at a distance, that he knew what was said in private rooms, that he had lived before and would live again. Archaeologists have noted that the fortresses under Sinan's control, particularly Masyaf itself, show evidence of sophisticated water storage systems, agricultural terracing, and defensive architecture that would have allowed the communities within them to sustain themselves through extended isolation. This was not a network of fanatics living on faith alone. It was a carefully engineered society, built to survive without depending on the outside world for anything essential. And Sinan understood something about belief that most rulers of his era did not. That a man who is genuinely convinced his leader possesses something beyond ordinary human capacity will do things that no amount of pay or coercion could produce. The Fedayeen, who served under Sinan, did not require external motivation. The motivation was internal, absolute, and silent in the way that only the deepest convictions can be silent. The fortress of Masyaf still stands today. It sits above the modern Syrian city of the same name. Its stones worn but largely intact, its towers visible from the valley floor below. UNESCO has recognized it as part of a group of Syrian castles of historical significance, and within its walls, researchers have identified chambers whose original purpose remains uncertain. Spaces that do not align cleanly with the standard military or residential functions of a medieval fortress. One theory suggests some of these spaces served as sites for the kind of initiatory instruction that Sinan used to deepen the commitment of his inner circle, rooms where the layered Ismaili teachings were passed down in controlled conditions, away from the general population of the fortress. What remains unexplained is the full extent of what was taught there, and how much of it was ever written down before the Syrian network began its long, slow dissolution in the decades following Sinan's death in 1193. He left no memoir, no theological treatise attributed to him, with certainty has survived. He passed through history the way the organization he led was designed to pass through everything, leaving behind just enough to be remembered and not quite enough to be fully understood. A general with 100,000 soldiers can be countered by another general with 100,000 soldiers. But a man who can reach inside your camp in the night, who knows the names of the people closest to you, who has already considered your response before you have thought to make it, that is something that no known military doctrine of the 12th century had prepared anyone to face. Saladin understood that. He rode away from Masyaf and left Sinan to his mountains, and the mountains kept his secrets long after he was gone. There is a particular kind of loss that history has no good language for. Not the loss of a battle, or a dynasty, or even a generation of people, though all of those happened here too. This is the loss of what was written down, what was recorded, preserved, carried forward through decades of careful hands, and then burned in a single afternoon. In the winter of 1256, the Mongol general Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived at the base of the Alborz Mountains with an army that contemporary sources place somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers. He had already carved a path of systematic destruction across Central Asia. Cities that had stood for 5 centuries were reduced to fields of ash and bone. What made Hulagu different from many conquerors was not the scale of his violence, which was extraordinary, but the deliberateness of it. He did not destroy carelessly. He destroyed with intention. The network assassin fortresses had been a problem for the Mongol Empire for years, not because the Nizari Ismailis could challenge Mongol military power directly. No force in the region could do that by this point, but because the assassins represented exactly the kind of decentralized, invisible threat that conventional armies had no reliable answer to. A Mongol general could not march his cavalry against an idea. He could not lay siege to a network. And so Hulagu came to do what armies do when subtlety has failed. He came to remove the architecture entirely. The last imam of Alamut, a young man named Rukn al-Din Kursha, had inherited leadership of the order under circumstances that left him poorly positioned for what was coming. He was not Hassan-i Sabbah. He was not Sinan. He was a man caught between a collapsing institution and an overwhelming force, and the accounts that survive, including those preserved in the Jami al-Tawarik of Rashid al-Din, describe a figure who moved through a series of negotiations and surrenders with the desperate hope that cooperation might spare what remained. It did not. Rukn al-Din surrendered Alamut in December of 1256. He was taken to the Mongol court, shuffled between audiences with Mongol officials for months, and eventually executed somewhere along a road in Persia, the precise location lost to the centuries. His followers, those who had not already scattered into the surrounding mountains and valleys, were hunted down in the weeks that followed, and the fortress, that ancient structure on its narrow ridge, was taken apart stone by stone. But before the walls came down, something happened inside Alamut that most accounts of this period pass over too quickly. The scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was there. Al-Tusi was one of the most remarkable scientific minds of the 13th century, a mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, and theologian who had been living and working within the Alamut complex for years, whether by choice or as something close to a captive, depending on which source you read. When the Mongols arrived, Al-Tusi made a decision that required a particular kind of courage and a particular kind of clarity. He stepped forward, presented himself to Hulagu's commanders, and offered his knowledge in exchange for his life and for the preservation of whatever could still be saved. Hulagu accepted. Al-Tusi went on to establish the Maraga Observatory in northwestern Persia under Mongol patronage, one of the most advanced astronomical institutions of the medieval world. The tables he produced there, the Zij-e-Ilkhani, influenced Islamic and European astronomy for the next 3 centuries. Some of the manuscripts he carried out of Alamut almost certainly contributed to the knowledge base he brought to Maraga, but what he carried out was a fraction of what was there. Archaeologists have noted, based on the partial inventories that survive in later Persian and Arabic sources, that the library at Alamut was described by multiple independent witnesses as containing tens of thousands of volumes. Philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and beyond the conventional sciences, documents internal to the Nizari organization itself, records of operations, correspondence between fortress commanders across Persia and Syria, the accumulated theological and esoteric writings of nearly 2 centuries of Ismaili scholarship that existed nowhere else in the world. What remains unexplained is the full scope of what was destroyed. The Mongol forces burned what they did not take. What Al-Tusi could not carry, could not hide, could not argue for, went into the fire, and the fire, by all accounts, burned for days. One theory suggests that Rukn al-Din, or members of his inner circle, had anticipated the fall and arranged for portions of the archive to be moved before the Mongols arrived. The Nizari network was still partially functional in the months leading up to the surrender, and there are later Ismaili communities in Persia, Syria, and eventually India that possessed texts and traditions that seem to carry traces of Alamut's intellectual heritage. Whether this represents a deliberate rescue operation or simply the natural diffusion of ideas through a dispersed community is something scholars, including Vladimir Ivanov, who conducted some of the earliest systematic research into surviving Ismaili manuscripts in the 1920s and 30s, spent years attempting to untangle without reaching a clean conclusion. What is certain is this: a library that had been built over 160 years, in a fortress specifically chosen for its inaccessibility, maintained by an organization that understood better than almost anyone alive the value of information and the danger of its loss, was reduced in a matter of days to ash and scattered stone, and we have been working with the absence of it ever since. Every account of the assassins that exists today was written either by their enemies, by outside observers who had limited access to the truth of what happened inside those walls, or by later Ismaili communities working from fragments and memory. The assassins never got to tell their own story in full. That story went up with the library. There is something that sits quietly beneath the surface of all the history we have been moving through tonight. Not just the political maneuvering, not just the assassinations and the fortresses and the fallen viziers. Something older and slower. The feeling that what we know about this organization is, at best, the outline of a much larger shape. That somewhere in those burned pages were answers to questions we have not even thought to ask yet. The Mongols destroyed Alamut, but they could not destroy what had already left it, and what survived, where it went, and what it became next, is a thread that does not end in 1256. It simply goes underground. Most stories about the assassins end at Alamut. The Mongols came, the walls fell, the libraries burned, and the history books close the chapter with a kind of finality that feels almost too clean. A movement that had survived for over a century and a half, that had outlasted caliphates and crusades, and the combined military pressure of half the medieval Islamic world, simply vanished. Absorbed into the dust of the Alborz Mountains, along with everything else Hulagu Khan left behind in the winter of 1256. That is the version of events that most textbooks are comfortable with. It is not the whole story. What actually happened in the decades following the fall of Alamut is one of the most quietly remarkable survival stories in the entire historical record, and it begins not with a dramatic escape or a heroic last stand, but with something far more characteristic of the organization Hassan-i Sabbah had built. It begins with disappearance. The Nizari Ismaili community, the broader religious movement from which the assassins had emerged, and which they had always understood themselves to be serving, did not die at Alamut. It scattered, deliberately, methodically, and in ways that suggest the possibility of prior planning that historians have never been able to fully reconstruct. Communities surfaced in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the valleys of Syria, in the coastal regions of what is now Pakistan and Western India. They did not announce themselves. They did not carry banners or build new fortresses. They simply continued, quietly, in the buried spaces between more powerful neighbors. The Syrian branch, centered at the fortress of Masyaf under the legacy of Sinan, had already been operating with considerable autonomy from Alamut for decades. After 1256, this branch came under increasing pressure from the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which had its own complicated relationship with the assassins, having used them as an instrument of state policy even while officially regarding them with suspicion. By the early 1300s, the Syrian assassins had been effectively absorbed into the Mamluk military apparatus. They were still there. They were simply no longer independent. One theory suggests that certain Mamluk sultans quietly maintained the assassins' operational networks for their own purposes long after the organization had ceased to exist in any formal sense, essentially licensing the infrastructure without acknowledging it. In Persia itself, the imams of the Nizari line did not disappear. For roughly 2 centuries following the fall of Alamut, the Nizari imams moved through Persia in concealment, sometimes posing as Sufi mystics, sometimes as ordinary merchants, their true identity known only to a small circle of initiates. This practice, known in Ismaili tradition as taqiyya, the concealment of one's true beliefs under conditions of persecution, had deep theological roots and practical consequences that allowed the community to persist through conditions that would have destroyed a more visible organization. They had, in a very real sense, become exactly what Hassan-i Sabbah had originally designed them to be. Invisible, the line eventually resurfaced openly in the early 19th century. And what happened next is the detail that most documentaries about the assassins leave out entirely. In 1817, the 45th Imam of the Nizari Ismaili line, a man named Shah Khalilullah, was killed in Yazd during a period of civil unrest in Persia. His son, Hassan Ali Shah, inherited the imamate and was granted the title of Aga Khan by the Shah of Persia, a title meaning roughly lord and master, in recognition of his standing and influence. The relationship between the Aga Khan and the Qajar dynasty deteriorated over the following decades, and in 1840, following an unsuccessful uprising against the Persian governor of Kerman, Hassan Ali Shah led his followers out of Persia entirely. He moved first to Afghanistan, then to Sindh, where he assisted British forces during military operations in the region, and finally to India, where he settled permanently in Bombay. The British, who had a considerable interest in maintaining relationships with influential Muslim leaders across their expanding empire, recognized his title and his authority. The first Aga Khan died in 1881 and was succeeded by his son and then his grandson. The fourth and current Aga Khan, Shah Karim al-Husseini, known formally as Aga Khan IV, was born in 1936, educated at Le Rosey in Switzerland, and then at Harvard University, where he studied Islamic history. He assumed the imamate in 1957 at the age of 20, and he has led the global Nizari Ismaili community for nearly 7 decades since. Pause on that for a moment. The man who currently leads the direct institutional and spiritual descendant of the organization, Hassan-i Sabbah, founded in the mountains of 11th century Persia, holds a degree from Harvard, oversees a network of development organizations operating in over 30 countries, and is estimated to be among the wealthiest individuals on the planet. The Aga Khan Development Network, which operates hospitals, schools, financial institutions, and cultural programs across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, is one of the largest private development organizations in the world. This is not a footnote. This is the continuation of a story that most people assume ended in 1256. One theory suggests that certain internal traditions of the Nizari community, practices, and bodies of knowledge maintained through the long centuries of concealment have never been made public and remain within the community to this day. What remains unexplained is the precise content of the theological and organizational knowledge that survived the burning of Alamut's library, carried forward not in documents but in the living memory of the imams and their closest circle across nearly 1,000 years. The assassins did not vanish. They evolved. They shed the fortress and the dagger and the silence of the mountains, and they became something that Hassan-i Sabbah, for all his extraordinary foresight, perhaps could not have fully imagined. A global community, a network of institutions, a presence in the modern world that operates not through fear, but through influence, not through the elimination of enemies, but through the quieter and arguably more durable work of building things that last. The name has changed. The methods have changed beyond recognition. But the lineage is unbroken. And somewhere in that continuity, between the dagger on Sultan Sanjar's floor and the development offices in Geneva and Nairobi and Karachi, there is a thread that runs without interruption across 9 centuries of human history. Most people never think to follow it. When Hulagu Khan's forces came down through the Alborz Mountains in the winter of 1256, They were not just destroying a fortress, they were ending something that had taken nearly 2 centuries to build. And among everything that burned in the days following Alamut's fall, one loss stands apart from the rest. Not because it was the most dramatic, but because its full weight has never been properly reckoned with. The library. Medieval sources describe the collection at Alamut in terms that, even accounting for the tendency toward exaggeration in chronicle writing of the period, suggests something genuinely extraordinary. The Persian historian Juvaini, who accompanied Hulagu's campaign and was one of the few outside observers to actually enter Alamut before it was fully destroyed, wrote that the library contained an enormous number of books on all branches of knowledge. He selected from among them what he judged to be works of merit and ordered the rest burned. What Juvaini preserved, what he deemed worth keeping, what was in those volumes? That is the question that sits at the center of one of the most genuinely unexplained absences in medieval intellectual history. Not a mystery manufactured for the purposes of a documentary, but a real and documented gap in the human record, acknowledged by serious historians across decades of scholarship. What we know survived gives us some indication of the character of the collection. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the most significant scientific minds of the 13th century, had spent years at Alamut as a resident scholar before the Mongol arrival. Whether he was there voluntarily or as a kind of honored captive has been debated. But what is not debated is that he was productive. At Alamut, he completed major works in mathematics, logic, and ethics. He wrote his Akhlaq-i Nasiri, a foundational text in Persian ethical philosophy, during his years inside the fortress. When Hulagu arrived, Al-Tusi chose to enter Mongol service, and he brought with him enough standing and persuasion to secure the construction of the Maraga Observatory, which became the most advanced astronomical research facility in the world at that time. The knowledge Al-Tusi carried out in his own mind and in the materials he managed to preserve represents one current of what Alamut contained: mathematics, astronomy, systematic philosophy. These were the respectable currents, the ones that Juvaini and later scholars were comfortable acknowledging. Archaeologists have noted something less comfortable. During excavations at the Alamut site, conducted initially by the scholar Vladimir Ivanov in the 1960s and continued by Iranian archaeological teams in subsequent decades, researchers identified among the ruins what appeared to be the remains of a laboratory space. Stone vessels, residue traces consistent with chemical processing, structures that did not align with residential or purely storage functions. The full analysis of these findings has never been comprehensively published in a single accessible form, and what remains unexplained is the precise nature of the work carried out in those rooms. One theory suggests that the assassins maintained a sophisticated working knowledge of pharmacology and toxicology that went considerably beyond what was commonly available in the medieval Islamic world. This would not be entirely surprising given the organizational incentives involved. A group that relied on precise, undetectable elimination of specific individuals, and that needed its operatives to remain calm under conditions of extreme stress, would have had powerful practical reasons to invest in exactly this kind of knowledge. Several deaths attributed to assassin operations in contemporary chronicles involved no visible wound, no witness to an attack, no physical evidence of violence. Targets who had been healthy simply became ill and died. Whether this reflects the use of sophisticated compounds, the natural deaths of aging men under stress, or something else entirely, cannot be established from the surviving record. But the question has not gone away. The theological library presents its own category of lost knowledge. The Nizari Ismaili tradition organized religious understanding in layers, with deeper esoteric interpretations of the Quran and Islamic history reserved for initiates who had progressed through the ranks of the Dawah. These inner teachings, the Batini interpretations that the Sunni establishment found so threatening, were almost certainly documented in the collection at Alamut. The outer world never had access to them while the fortress stood. After 1256, they ceased to exist in written form. What remains unexplained is how much of this inner theological knowledge survived in oral tradition, carried forward by imams and senior initiates through the long centuries of concealment that followed the Mongol destruction. The current Nizari Ismaili community maintains that the living imam is the authoritative interpreter of the tradition, which implies a continuity of understanding that does not depend on written texts, but the precise relationship between what was documented at Alamut and what has been transmitted across the generations since is not something the community has made available for external scholarly examination. Bernard Lewis, whose work The Assassins, a radical sect in Islam, remains one of the foundational texts in the field, observed that the destruction of Alamut's library represented an almost total erasure of the Ismaili perspective on their own history. Everything we know about the assassins from that period comes from sources that were, without exception, hostile to them. The Seljuk chronicles, the Crusader accounts, the Mongol records, even Juvaini, who physically stood inside Alamut and held those books in his hands, was writing in service of the power that had just destroyed the place. We have never heard the assassins speak in their own voice. Not once. Every account we have of who they were and what they believed was written by someone who wanted them gone. And that silence, that ancient and undisturbed silence, where their own words should be, may be the most revealing thing about them that still remains. There is a question that serious historians have circled for decades without ever quite landing on a clean answer. If the assassins were truly an independent revolutionary movement, operating purely in service of the Nizari Ismaili cause, then their target selection across a century and a half of operations should reflect a consistent internal logic. Strike the enemies of the Ismaili community, protect the Imam, advance the Dawah, the dagger as an extension of theology, and for stretches of their history, that logic holds. The early operations under Hassan-i Sabbah fit the pattern cleanly enough. Nizam al-Mulk was the architect of Sunni institutional power in the Seljuk Empire. His removal served obvious Ismaili strategic interests. The governors and judges who fell in the decades that followed were, in most cases, identifiable opponents of the movement. But then the pattern begins to fracture. Conrad of Montferrat was a Christian king. His theological relationship to the Nizari Ismaili cause was essentially non-existent. He was not persecuting Ismaili communities. He was not a figure of Sunni religious authority. He was a Crusader noble navigating the extraordinarily complex politics of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1192. And yet two Fedayeen reached him in the streets of Tyre and ended his life days after his election as king. Who benefited? That question is not rhetorical. It is the question that contemporaries asked immediately, and it is the question that historians like Marshall Hodgson in The Order of Assassins, and more recently Niall Christie in his work on the Crusades, have returned to repeatedly without achieving consensus. Richard I of England had a documented political conflict with Conrad over the leadership of the Crusader forces in the Holy Land. Conrad's election as king had been a direct challenge to Richard's preferred candidate. The timeline between Conrad's election and his death was a matter of days, and Richard was known to have had prior contact with Sinan, the leader of the Syrian assassins, through diplomatic channels that neither side fully documented. One theory suggests that the Conrad assassination was a commissioned operation, that someone with sufficient resources and sufficient motive paid for access to the assassin's network in exactly the way that a modern state might contract with an intelligence service operating outside official channels. The assassins, on this reading, were not purely ideological actors. They were also, at least occasionally, available. This is not a comfortable theory. It destabilizes the entire framework through which the assassins are usually understood. But the historical record provides enough anomalies to keep it alive. Saladin presents perhaps the most layered case. He and Sinan engaged in a confrontation in the 1170s that ended in a negotiated arrangement rather than open warfare, and the terms of that arrangement were never made public. What is documented is that Saladin, who had the military capacity to press an assault on Masyaf, chose not to, and that, in the years following this arrangement, several of Saladin's own rivals and political inconveniences met ends that the chronicles treat with varying degrees of suspicion. What remains unexplained is whether the understanding reached between Saladin and Sinan included any form of operational cooperation, and if so, against whom and on whose authorization. The Crusader states themselves maintained a relationship with the Syrian assassins that went well beyond simple hostility. The Knights Hospitaller, headquartered at the Crac des Chevaliers in what is now western Syria, collected a form of tribute from the Assassin-controlled territories in the surrounding region. This arrangement, documented in Hospitaller records from the 12th century, meant that one of the most powerful Christian military orders in the Holy Land was in a sustained financial relationship with the organization that had just killed a Christian king. Archaeologists have noted that the physical proximity of Hospitaller and assassin territories in this region was not incidental, but reflected decades of managed coexistence that neither side had strong incentives to disrupt. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the symbolic center of Sunni Islamic authority, and theoretically the assassin's most fundamental ideological enemy, also appears in the historical record, in positions that complicate a simple narrative of total opposition. Several Abbasid political figures who represented threats to the caliph's immediate interests died in ways that invited suspicion, and in at least 2 documented cases, subsequent investigations pointed toward Alamut without anyone in Baghdad pressing the matter to a conclusion. One theory suggests that even the Abbasid court, at moments of particular political pressure, found it useful to have access to a deniable instrument of elimination, and that the relationship between Baghdad and Alamut was never as straightforwardly adversarial as official chronicles on both sides preferred to present. What this accumulation of anomalies suggests is something that the historian Hodgson articulated carefully, and that subsequent scholarship has not fully resolved. The assassins may have functioned, for significant periods of their existence, as a kind of freelance geopolitical instrument available to multiple actors simultaneously, playing different roles for different clients while maintaining their own internal agenda as the constant beneath the surface. This would explain several things that the purely ideological model struggles with. It would explain target selections that seem inconsistent with Ismaili strategic interests. It would explain the organization's financial sustainability across nearly 2 centuries without a conventional economic base. And it would explain the remarkable degree to which powerful actors who had every reason to destroy Alamut consistently chose accommodation instead. What remains unexplained, and what no historian has been able to establish with confidence from the surviving record, is the decision-making architecture that would have governed these arrangements. Who within the organization had the authority to accept external commissions? What was the relationship between operational decisions and theological justification? Was there an inner circle, above even the senior Fedayeen, whose existence was unknown to the broader membership? The layered structure of the organization, the same compartmentalization that made it impossible to penetrate from the outside, makes it equally impossible to reconstruct from the inside looking back. We can see the operations. We can trace the outcomes. We can document the anomalies in target selection and the suspicious accommodations made by supposedly hostile powers. But the center of it, the room where the real decisions were made and the real relationships were maintained, remains exactly as Hassan-i Sabbah designed it to remain: buried, silent, and beyond reach. There is a particular kind of influence that never gets acknowledged in official histories. Not the influence of conquest, where one power defeats another and rewrites the record in its own name. Not the influence of culture, where art and language and philosophy drift across borders over generations, but the influence of method, the quiet inheritance of how to do something passed forward through centuries, adopted and adapted by institutions that would never dream of naming their source. The assassins left this kind of influence, and it is visible once you know where to look. Begin with the structural problem they solved. Hassan-i Sabbah faced a challenge that every insurgent movement, every intelligence service, and every clandestine organization since has had to confront in some form. How do you build a network that can operate across vast distances, survive the capture of individual members, maintain operational security against sophisticated enemies, and sustain itself across generations without a conventional institutional base? His answer was compartmentalization. The cell structure, the need-to-know architecture in which each member holds only the fragment of information required for their specific function. Nothing more. A captured Fedayeen could not betray the network because he genuinely did not know the network. He knew his task, his contact, his target. The larger picture existed only at the center, and the center was in a mountain fortress surrounded by people who had chosen, with full understanding, to die before speaking. This is not a medieval curiosity. This is the foundational architecture of modern clandestine operations. Bruce Hoffman, one of the most cited scholars in contemporary terrorism and intelligence studies, traces in Inside Terrorism the direct conceptual lineage between the organizational models of historical secret societies and the cell structures adopted by 20th century insurgent movements. The French resistance during the Second World War operated on principles of compartmentalization that their organizers understood explicitly as lessons drawn from the history of underground movements. Each cell knew the identities of its own members and its immediate contact point. When the Gestapo broke one cell, the network survived because the broken cell was genuinely all that its members could give. The same architecture appears in the operational design of Cold War intelligence services on both sides. The Soviet GRU ran networks of sleeper agents, embedded in foreign societies for years or decades, activated only when needed, connected to the broader network through a single handler who was himself connected upward through a chain that no individual agent could trace. The CIA's own station structures in hostile territories operated on similar principles. One theory suggests that the explicit study of historical models, including the assassins, formed part of the intellectual background of mid-20th century intelligence theory, though the institutional appetite for acknowledging this openly has always been limited. What remains unexplained is the precise pathway through which these organizational principles traveled from the mountains of medieval Persia into the operational doctrine of modern states. The connection is real but diffuse, carried forward not through direct institutional inheritance, but through the accumulated scholarship of people who studied the assassins, and then went on to think about intelligence and insurgency in professional contexts. The scholar and intelligence analyst Miles Copeland, who worked with the CIA during its early decades, wrote in his memoirs about the degree to which historical models of clandestine organization informed the thinking of the agency's founders. He did not name the assassins specifically, but the structural principles he described map, with considerable precision, onto what Hassan-i Sabbah built at Alamut 9 centuries earlier. The psychological dimension of the assassin legacy is equally significant and equally unacknowledged. The deliberate cultivation of an enemy's fear, independent of actual operational capacity, is a principle that runs through modern psychological operations doctrine, with a directness that requires no interpretation. The dagger on Sultan Sanjar's pillow was not primarily a demonstration of physical capability. It was information warfare. It was the transmission of a message designed to alter the target's behavior, his decision-making, his willingness to act against the organization without the expenditure of any actual violence. Modern psychological operations, the branch of military and intelligence activity devoted to influencing the perceptions and behavior of adversaries through information rather than force, operates on this same foundational insight. The most effective threat is the one that never has to be carried out, because the target has already internalized the message and adjusted accordingly. Archaeologists have noted, in the behavioral sense that strategic analysts use the term, that the assassins' most significant achievements were often the operations they did not conduct, the targets who changed policy, who withdrew armies, who negotiated accommodations, not because they had been struck, but because they understood that they could be. This is deterrence. It is the same logic that governed nuclear strategy during the Cold War, the same logic that underlies modern cyber operations, the same logic that intelligence services apply when they allow an adversary to discover, carefully and selectively, the extent of their reach. Hassan-i Sabbah understood deterrence in 1100. He understood it without the vocabulary, without the academic framework, without the institutional support of a state. He understood it because he had thought with extraordinary clarity about the relationship between fear and power and the most efficient possible use of limited resources. That clarity did not die at Alamut. It entered the permanent record of how human beings organize themselves to operate in the shadows against forces larger than themselves. And every intelligence service that has ever run a cell network, every insurgent movement that has ever used compartmentalization to survive, every strategist who has ever chosen the precise symbolic act over the costly direct assault, has been, knowingly or not, working in the very long shadow of a scholar from Qom who climbed a mountain in northern Persia and decided to change the world without an army. 9 centuries is a long time, long enough for the fortress at Alamut to crumble into the stone of the Alborz Mountains its walls slowly reclaimed by wind and altitude and the indifference of passing centuries. Long enough for the name assassin to travel from a whispered curse in the courts of medieval Persia into every major language on earth. Long enough for the world to change so completely around the memory of what happened in those mountains that the memory itself seems to belong to a different species of human experience. And yet, there is a particular kind of idea that does not age in the way that stone ages or empires age, an idea built not around a specific technology or a specific theology or a specific geography, but around a permanent tension in human experience. The tension between power that concentrates and awareness that resists it, between the system that grows too large and the individual who understands, quietly and without announcement, that something within it has gone wrong. That tension has not faded. If anything, in the early decades of the 21st century, it has sharpened. We live in a world of total informational visibility, or something close enough to it that the difference barely matters in practice. Every search query leaves a trace. Every financial transaction is recorded. Every movement through a city observed by cameras whose footage is processed by algorithms that recognize faces, gaits, patterns of behavior. The surveillance infrastructure that the most ambitious medieval ruler could only have dreamed of constructing has been built, quietly and incrementally, into the architecture of ordinary daily life. And in this environment, the instinct that Hassan-i Sabbah organized into a movement, the instinct to remain unseen, to act with precision from a position of deliberate anonymity, to refuse the system's demand for total legibility, has not disappeared. It has found new instruments. Edward Snowden walked out of a National Security Agency facility in 2013, carrying documentation of a global surveillance apparatus whose existence had been officially denied. He had no army. He held no political office. He operated through a single journalist and a single filmmaker working in a hotel room in Hong Kong. The information he released altered the policies of governments across the world, forced the restructuring of intelligence programs, and changed the behavior of hundreds of millions of ordinary people who began, for the first time, to think carefully about what their devices were recording and where that information was going. One theory suggests that the most significant acts of political disruption in the contemporary world no longer require violence, territory, or conventional organizational structure. They require only information, the willingness to act on it, and the capacity to disappear. WikiLeaks operated for years as a stateless publisher, with no fixed headquarters, no conventional institutional structure, and no membership in the ordinary sense. Its ability to receive, protect, and selectively release sensitive documentation from inside the most powerful institutions on Earth derived precisely from its structural invisibility. Archaeologists have noted, in the organizational sense, that the architecture of WikiLeaks bears a striking resemblance to the need-to-know compartmentalization of the Nizari network. Sources knew their submission point. They did not know the organization. The organization knew the material. It did not always know the source. The collective, known as Anonymous, represents perhaps the most literal contemporary expression of the assassin structural principle. No leadership, no headquarters, no membership roster, no hierarchy that can be mapped or decapitated, only a shared orientation toward specific targets and a distributed capacity to act that survives the removal of any individual participant. Because no individual participant holds the whole, what remains unexplained is whether any of this is conscious inheritance or pure convergence. Whether the architects of these modern movements studied the assassins deliberately or simply arrived, through their own analysis of the problem of operating against concentrated power, at the same structural conclusions that Hassan-i Sabbah reached in the 11th century. Perhaps it does not matter. The convergence itself is the point. If Hassan-i Sabbah were alive today, the mountain fortress would be unnecessary. The dagger would be unnecessary. The years of patient infiltration through physical space would be replaced by something faster and in certain respects more precise. But the foundational understanding that a small group with clarity of purpose, rigorous operational security, and the willingness to act from the shadows can move against power far larger than itself and leave that power permanently altered, that understanding would require no revision whatsoever. The spirit that built Alamut did not need Alamut to survive. It needed only people who understood that anonymity is not weakness, that patience is not passivity, that the most durable form of resistance is the kind that cannot be located, cannot be negotiated with, and cannot be made to stop simply by removing its most visible face. That understanding is older than the internet, older than the nation-state, older than the printing press. It is, in the most literal sense, ancient. And tonight, in the quiet of wherever you are, with whatever hour the clock above you is keeping, it is still here, still watching, still patient, still waiting for the precise moment, just as it always has been. Some stories have endings. This is not one of them. What we are experiencing together today is not a complete picture. It will never be a complete picture, because those at its center have spent 150 years ensuring that no complete picture ever exists. Every layer of the organization is designed to be undetectable from the outside. Every document is encrypted to the point that it cannot be recovered or destroyed before the enemy can reach it. Each agent is trained to carry only the necessary information and nothing more. Hassan-i Sabbah did not build a movement. He built an absence, a form entirely shaped by its surroundings, existing only in the fear it left in the annals of its enemies, in the anomalies that serious historians have quietly noted for decades, in the questions that continue to be asked no matter how many times official documents claim they have been resolved. The Alamut fortress still stands, like a remnant, stone and silence on a slope of the Alborz range, now visited by historians and tourists who climb the very slopes where the Mongols once landed. The laboratories remain, their purpose yet undetermined. The outlines of the library remain, shaped by the absence of everything that once filled them, and somewhere in the vibrant flow of a global community, whose uninterrupted origins lie within those walls, perhaps still preserved knowledge untouched by the flames. That knowledge was passed down not through written texts, but through the oldest and most enduring form of communication humankind has ever conceived. A voice, a room, a generation after generation. Perhaps we will never know the contents of those books. Perhaps we will never know the full structure of the network, the true decision behind Conrad's assassination, the precise terms of any agreement that took place between Sinan and Saladin in a room no historian is allowed to enter. But the questions remain. And questions that refuse to be buried will drag one into the darkness that follows. If it's the kind of history that keeps you awake at night, or perhaps, on a quiet night like this, gently lulls you to sleep with something still lingering in your mind, then Mr. H is here. There is still much to discover. Always has been. Subscribe, stay updated, and let us know in the comments below which part of this story resonated with you most tonight. And, wherever you're listening from in the world, thank you for being here. The silence the killers left behind still resonates. You just need to know how to listen to it.